I suck at jiu-jitsu. How do I suck less at jiu-jitsu?
I guess to suck less.
Ladies and gentlemen, the diabolical leader of the Headlock Squad.
Hey everybody, this is Josh McKinney, and I just want to welcome you to the newest episode of the I Suck at Jiu-Jitsu show. So we are back with interviews again, with new interviews. We're not having to go back and do reposts anymore. Well, I'm sure we'll do those in the future. Who knows? But for right now, we are back to recording. I'm getting some time to be able to chat with my friends again. And I know that for a lot of people, that is their favorite part of the podcast. And for a lot of us, me included, we're just getting a little tired of Josh talking. And so getting to hear from other people is exciting. And I thought that this is actually an interview that we had to reschedule like 2 or 3 different times. It was like being sick and having a baby and just all kinds of random craziness made us reschedule this interview. But this is one that I've been actually wanting to do for a very long time. And I think that this interview is going to be so beneficial for so many people. We're actually going to piggyback this interview and do a Thursday episode continuing with kind of what this conversation is about. And of course, it's rambly and it's fun. But this conversation with Steve Kwan, the host of BJJ Mental Models, is to me is a big hole for a lot of people in the jiu-jitsu space. And it is how to ask questions. It's how to gain a deeper understanding. And I think that so many people struggle with this. If you have ever taught a jiu-jitsu class, you have asked the blank question before: does everybody get this? Or what would anybody like to learn today? And what you'll find is most of the time people don't have any good answer to that question, because learning to ask questions is a skill in itself. And to me, I've gotten to be on a lot of podcasts at this point, and I've gotten to have so many conversations with so many high-level people. But something that Steve has to me that is just unbelievable is his ability to dig deeper. If you guys listened to when I was on the BJJ Mental Models podcast, Steve and I talked about designated winner and how he was able to ask, it almost felt like the same question with just little variations to get me to explain deeper and to try to almost challenged me to understand my content and what I was trying to explain better. And I think that he does such a good job of this. So I wanted to try to use his skill set and ask him questions to try to dig a little deeper in understanding how to understand things deeper. And I think that we did a really good job of this. I also, we're going to be having his brother Matt on soon. I need to reach out, but you guys know how terribly lazy I am and bad I am at doing that stuff. But we're going to have Matt on soon. And I think both of these guys they ask phenomenal questions. And so getting to try to play on the other side of it and be the question asker was really, really fun for me. But besides that, I really think you guys you're gonna really love this episode. I love how it turned out. It is, to me, the reason that I like to do interviews, and the reason I like to do interviews in the way that we do them. It is very off the cuff and fun and organic. And it just, to me, it's been a while since I've done an interview like this. I've done an interview in general for the show. And so it was fun to get back to. I can't wait to keep these interviews rolling. And I can't wait to introduce you guys, if you have never heard the BJJ Mental Models podcast or checked out their premium site. I can't wait to introduce you guys to Steve. You guys are really going to love his ability to just convey information and some of his explanation on how to understand things deeper. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the episode. All right, Steve, how are you doing today?
I am doing good, buddy. How's it going?
Everything is good on my end. This is my first podcast back in it's probably only been a month, but it feels like forever. But yeah, first one back from being on dad duty for a long time.
Hey, like I said earlier, congratulations, man. Is this your first kid?
Yes, first kid.
How's your sleep schedule at the moment?
It couldn't be worse.
Yeah.
I
Sounds about
haven't
right.
I haven't slept in weeks. I was joking with a lot of people of like, man, I wish that people would have told me to not do this. Like, hey, it's gonna be so hard. You've never done something. No jiu-jitsu competition you've ever done even compares to this.
Yep.
It's gonna be hard.
I was talking to Rafael Lovato Jr. because he had twins recently, his first kids as well. And I asked him, what's harder, being a like 8-time world champion or having two kids who are crying at night and you're trying to get them both to sleep? And his answer was, what do you think? It's the kids. Obviously it's the kids. Way, way harder. Yeah, having kids is the hardest job that no one ever has any training for. Nothing can prepare you for it. I definitely remember the same thing. And I mean, I'm a pretty cautious guy. I did a lot of, research and prep, and I thought I knew what I was getting into, and I expected it was going to be real hard. But man, having a kid, especially a newborn, is way harder than I, even in my worst case scenario, possibly imagined. It is a life-changing amount of work in a way that is hard to describe to people who haven't been there before.
Yeah, man, there is no doubt about that. Something you already kind of mentioned it. Something that I thought would be fun to kind of touch on in this conversation is I know very few people who have gotten to have more conversations with high level grapplers and high level coaches. And, you just talked about Rafael Lovato Jr. And, when you look at the list of people that you've had on your podcast and getting to have those conversations, this is actually something that I asked you, I want to say when I was on Mental Models. But I just thought a fun place to start would be, do you ever get nervous before you have to interview one of these high level people, and if anybody springs to mind with that?
Honestly, not really. I mean, it's pajama wrestling, right? I mean, I've been in this ecosystem and long enough to know a few things. First of all, we do this for fun, right? It has to be fun. You have to try not to take it too seriously. But also, I mean, I've been around enough high level people. I've been to seminars enough to know that everyone in jiu-jitsu is very casual about this, right? It's not like walking into a boardroom with a bunch of billionaires who are gonna, rip you apart. It's jiu-jitsu people. Some people are more serious about it than others. They build their lives around jiu-jitsu, but at the end of the day, most people are relatively friendly, right? I've never had a bad experience on the podcast with anyone. Everyone's always been wonderful, easy to get along with. So, I mean, maybe there was nerves at the beginning, but now it's just the job, right? The other thing too is we don't do it live. We do a lot of cleanup and editing and post-production, mostly to make myself sound smarter. So the benefit to that is it can't possibly go that wrong, right? In the event that for some reason things just don't work out, or someone loses their train of thought, or the whole thing just goes off on a massive tangent, you can fix that in post, right? It's not that big a deal.
So for you, what made you start wanting to do the podcast? And I know I kind of actually listened to some Mental Models really early on, and it seemed like there was just this switch that flipped at one point where you were like, oh, I'm really going to commit to this. I really, really enjoy doing this. What kind of made that start happen? And then that transition of you being the Mental Models guy?
Yeah. So the backstory, for those who don't know, I think I've been training around 15 years at this point. I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt practicing out of BC, Canada. Probably most famously, I'm a hobbyist. I only train a few times a week at most. I used to train a lot more prior to having kids, but as I'm sure you will soon discover, it very much gets in the way of your training. It's hard to convince the wife to let me go pajama wrestle when there's a kid at home sometimes. So I got started a long time ago, but I've always been a hobbyist. I've never competed, nothing against it. It's just not what I wanted out of the sport. I just always thought of it as, look, it's something I want to do. I want to do martial arts. I want to learn how to defend myself, get in shape. I don't have any competitive aspirations. For me, this is a hobby. It's a thing I do for fun. I don't have any achievement-based goals out of it. My brother is also a jiu-jitsu black belt, completely different story, completely different lineage. Despite the fact that we're related, pretty much nothing about our journey is similar. He is a black belt under a different instructor. He does take jiu-jitsu very seriously. He's a full-time jiu-jitsu coach and competitor and teacher. So for him, this is his job, right? It's not just a thing he does for fun. It's tremendously important that he does it to the best of his ability, because that's how, he pays the bills. That's how he gets things done. But what we found, of course, being brothers, we're talking about jiu-jitsu all the time. It's always the topic of conversation at dinner between the two of us. And what we found is, despite the fact that we kind of have these two very different journeys, there were things about our approach that were very similar. And that was trying to dramatically simplify jiu-jitsu, make it just reduce it to kind of the bare bones conceptual framework. And that's kind of where BJJ mental models came up. It's terminology. The whole mental models thing is a term you hear in other fields. Basically, the idea is you're looking for big ideas or patterns that you can learn and reproduce and deploy later and just simplify your thinking, right? So we kind of came up with a list at the beginning of just ideas that we thought would be universal to jiu-jitsu. And then after publishing it on a website, we started the podcast, and then it just kind of snowballed from there. I would say that the moment where it really changed from being just a thing I wasn't really committed to being something that became a core focus of my life was when the pandemic happened. There was a lot of uncertainty, especially for my brother, who is, as a jiu-jitsu gym owner, nothing can screw up your business plans worse than a pandemic if you're a gym owner, right?
Yes.
So we got thinking, you know what? We'd always done this for free and basically eaten the cost ourselves of doing the podcast, which, as you know, is a lot more time and cost intensive than people probably assume it is. But we started at the time just a Patreon just to see if we could get anyone to basically throw money our way to help us out during the pandemic. And I was frankly shocked at how many people were willing to pay to hear my dumbass talk. I did not expect that anyone would sign up, and it dramatically exceeded our expectations. So that's when I kind of realized there might be something there. So since then, we've pivoted and we've expanded. And right now, the podcast is just one piece of what we do. As you know, we've got a whole coaching framework. We've got a whole course library that we sell directly to our premium subscribers. We're not so much on Patreon anymore. We have our own platform at bjjmentalmodels.com. So for me, I would say to answer your question, that was the big moment, was when we started asking for money and I realized, holy smokes, there are actually people who are willing to pay. That very much changed the relationship I had with the work, right? Because once it becomes something that you're making money off of and you realize I could conceivably feed my family doing this, that very much changes your level of focus and your level of investment in making it happen.
Yeah, I totally understand that. Something funny, I got to meet your brother through you and was on his podcast. And so gotten to talk back and forth with him, message back and forth with him on Instagram quite a bit. And something interesting to me is, personality wise, you two don't seem that similar to me. You seem
quite
very different. Yeah. And
you wouldn't necessarily think so if we were in the same room together, I think. But if you get one-on-one, I mean, we have, like I said, we're very different people. Really the main thing we have in common is jiu-jitsu, right? So that's kind of that was sort of the impetus of a lot of the work that I do, and also a lot of the work that he does, was we realized, well, hold on, you got this one guy who is a pro competitor black belt, who runs a gym full time. You got this other guy who like fits in 1 or 2 training sessions a week in between his video game breaks. But a lot of honestly, a lot of the big lessons that we learned throughout the journey were very similar. And that's kind of where we realized there might be this like unified framework of ideas that are going to be beneficial to everyone. And that's kind of how we got started on what we do.
Yeah, that is, I just noticed it as, talking to him a few times. There is a similar, slightly dark sense of humor from both of you that I noticed that crosses over.
Yes.
But I would say that, like, just in personality, I just like, man, these guys are so different. And it's so cool to see how much jujitsu can unite you. For me, my dad and I are both black belts, and we really are similar people, but still just having that family member that trains. Does anybody else in your family train?
At the moment, no. Well, actually, no, that's not true. My little girl does. She's very young though, and she's mostly training because we put her there. I'm very curious to see when she gets older, rather, if she continues to keep up with it when it's more her decision. She's still so young. I don't think she realizes that she kind of has a say in these things. My hope is that she is as in love with jiu-jitsu as her uncle and her dad are, but we will see.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that you don't want to force. It's like jujitsu's like broccoli.
Yeah.
If you're forced to eat it as a kid, most likely you'll hate it as an adult. And
that's my concern, right? So
yeah.
we try not to make it sound like this big competitive, stressful thing to her. We try to make it come across, given her age, like it's a kind of a fun kids club to go to, and that seems to have worked really well.
It was a really random, I don't want to overshare my son's life, his 2 weeks of life, but there was a
There's
point
not a lot
where
to share yet.
There was a point before he got circumcised where the urologist had to come in, and it was the most random thing. The urologist walks in, and I look, and I'm like, I know this lady from somewhere, and I give her a weird look, and she goes, "We know each other." And I go, "Oh, okay." And she goes, I'm so-and-so's, one of my black belt buddy's sister-in-law, and she made the statement of, is this the next jiu-jitsu world champion? And I was like, whoa. If he wants to be, it is, but I'm just worried about his penis right now. Okay. Could we just get that taken care of? Let's just go one thing at a time. Yeah, so you never want to force that on a kid. It seems like, I'm sure you've been around jiu-jitsu long enough that you see parents that do that, and their kids even have so much potential, and they end up falling off just because it was forced on them, and it becomes this point of stress and not this fun thing like how jiu-jitsu is for you and I. But yeah, you've mentioned a few times that you only train a couple times a week. What does that training look like for you?
Honestly, I mean, people who listen to the podcast might think that I've got this incredibly regimented genius training method, but it's really not. I mean, I'm not a gym owner, so I have very little say in my own training. And this is actually part of what I like to talk about on the show. There are so many hot topics in the community right now about modernized science-based training methods. But the challenge that a lot of students have is they can hear that. But look, if you want to practice like an ecologically informed approach at your gym, if you're a 2-stripe white belt, you may not have that much say in it. So what do you do, right? And that's always something I like to consider, is when you propose the better way to do things, is this something that a student can do themselves, or is this a message that needs to be communicated to the coach? Most of the classes I go to are pretty unremarkable. I mean, at this point in time, I'm mostly just going there for fun. Over the last year or so, I've just been so busy with work and the podcast, I've kind of tried to de-scope my jiu-jitsu training to just enjoy myself. You will have heard me talk about this a lot on the podcast recently, that I really believe the fundamentally most important thing about jiu-jitsu is that you have to have fun doing it. You talked about this earlier yourself, right? So easy for people, especially kids, to drop off. But we both know what happens to adults as well. I mean, jiu-jitsu does have a significant attrition rate. And part of that is just because it's a long ass journey, right? I mean, if you do it right, you're probably going to be doing it for the rest of your life. Hard to keep the motivation up the whole time through. And so recently I've just been trying to reconnect with the things about it that I really enjoy and that I find fun. And a lot of that comes down to less performance and more the social side, the cultural side, the opportunity to express yourself through movement. So basically, all of that is a long way to say what I've been doing is I've just basically been dicking around in class. I'm not really taking training seriously. I've been trying a lot of really weird, crazy, obscure turtle stuff to see if I can make it work. And most of what that's done so far is annoy my training partners. So I think it worked. That's basically what I've been doing. But yeah, my training is not particularly like highly competitive or anything like that. I just try to get the most out of the classes that I can and make peace with myself that I'm doing the best with the time I can invest into it. A lot of people beat themselves up, right? And they look down across the class and they see someone there who's training 4 hours a day every day, and then they get upset because they're not as good as that person. But I mean, look, at the end of the day, you have to have a healthy relationship with jiu-jitsu. And part of that means understanding, okay, I can commit X hours a week to do this, and I'm just going to get the most I can out of that time. And I'm going to be at peace with that afterwards. I'm not going to beat myself up. I'm not going to compare myself to the pros who are training 5 times more than me. Just within my little box here, am I happy with what I'm doing? And so that's kind of what I've been trying to do recently.
There's nothing more fun than learning the turtle stuff, right? I'm assuming you're Preet and Chris Payne's type turtle stuff. Is that kind of what you've been looking at?
So my turtle background is a little bit different. I have a different ethnic turtle background. I don't play Estonian turtle. I play Canadian turtle. It's a little bit different. The backstory here, though, is many years ago, I observed in training that when I was getting tapped out, it was almost always when someone was on my back. It very rarely was I getting tapped from mount or any other position. It was from the back. And after paying a bit more attention to that, I realized it's not actually when they get to my back that I'm having trouble. It is that they are slingshotting onto my back from turtle or something. And then before I know it, they got 2 hooks in and they're choking me, and I'm already done. The fact that they're on my back is not really the problem. The problem is I gave them a clear pathway there to get everything they wanted. So I kind of got to thinking, well, what happened if, I've identified the point of failure here is that turtle moment, that point where they can see your back, but they're not on it. And I'm making it too easy for them to get there. So I started just relentlessly pulling turtle to force myself into that position so that I would be able to build up defense there and just get reps and get practice. And over time, a few things happened. One is I got really good turtle defense. But the other thing is I got so comfortable and so experienced playing turtle that sometimes I can just kind of force people into that position and bait them, right? Because you know how jiu-jitsu people are. If they see your back, they can't resist. They have to try to take your back. And if you have really good back defense, you can exploit that. And then later I discovered Preet and his stuff, and I've kind of been adapting bits and pieces of that into my game. At a conceptual level, I agree with almost everything that he does, although I play positions a little bit differently. I'm still not super fluent on a lot of his more twisty guards like hawking. I find that a little bit awkward, and that's just my lack of practice. But I've spoken to Preet extensively about this, and we basically share the same philosophical framework, I think, to playing from that position.
Yeah, man, that is for years, that has always been this looked down upon position, especially amongst jiu-jitsu competitors, and the first time
not anymore, baby.
No,
turtle's back on the menu.
It is. And you look like so the first time I ever really experienced it. So my dad, like I said, he's he was in his 50s when we started jiu-jitsu, and you're gonna gravitate towards positions that work when you're not as athletic as everybody else. And so for him, he was always like, man, I really like this turtle position. I like watching Eduardo Tellez and in learning this. And years and years later, and I always thought, I think you should have good defense from everywhere. So it wasn't a position I avoided. But it wasn't a position I thought of as how strategic it could be and how offensive it could be. And I met Chris Payne's through my podcast, and eventually liked what he was telling me enough. I'm like, I got to bring this guy in for a seminar. And as we
why
talked,
his nickname is the Villain, right? Did he explain that?
Give me your. I mean, I've met him before, so I know why he's the villain.
Well, it's because, like any villain, he always loses. He sucks. He's terrible. He never wins anything.
He says that. I think we always joke that we are the other side of the world, the same person though. And so we have both always joked that and you can actually hear it the first time I had him on the podcast. We do 90 minutes, and I had this list of questions I was going to ask him, and it started to digress. And I started to go, wait, how do you feel about warm-ups? And he's like, oh, they're trash. He's like, I'll never have my guys shrimping up and down the mat. And we started to get deeper. And then at this point, it was like in Step Brothers, where he goes, did we just become best friends?
Yeah.
And ever since then, we've had this, this relationship. And the time we first get to roll, it's kind of a weird situation that you learn about somebody's philosophy and realize it matches your own so much, but you still have to test if the other guy sucks, right? And so the first time we get to roll, we go just absolutely do like an hour straight. And I think for both of us, we would agree, like, yeah, we hardly ever get submitted by anybody. And we both generally can submit people at will. And I want to say we have both gotten like 2 submissions each in an hour, and we rolled straight through in the hour. And it was just afterwards, we just kind of sat there staring at each other like, this is awesome. This is so cool. And for me, I was like, I need to work this turtle position, because I would get him in these turtle positions where I expect, okay, I'm going to win. I'm going to submit this guy. And then I wouldn't. And then he would sweep me. He would, he just would do all of the Chris Payne's villain stuff. And since then, we've really, just for my whole school, we've adapted that position. And for me, every Saturday, I only work turtle. And so every round I start in turtle, and guys try to smash me. And it is, to me, the most fun day of training. One, because it protects my body so much more than when I'm trying to pass the guard and when I'm trying to get submissions. But then also, there is nothing more fun about like pulling that piece of cheese away from people when they're really sure that they're going to submit you. And so for you, with all these different conversations you've gotten to have with all kinds of different high-level people, is there anybody who sticks out as having more of an influence or an effect on your game in jiu-jitsu?
From the people I've spoken.
Hey guys, Josh McKinney here. I just want to interrupt this podcast and give you guys a little information about what is happening at simplifyingjiujitsu.com. So a lot of people have already checked out, have already purchased our efficient strength for BJJ in 15 minutes. This is my dad's kind of life work when it comes to jiu-jitsu strength and conditioning. He's been working on this. He's been working as a personal trainer and a fitness expert for over 30 years, but then he's been working with jiu-jitsu athletes for over 15 years. And this is kind of the culmination of all of his work. But what's even exciting, the reason I wanted to bring it back to your attention, is we actually just made some big additions to this program. We just added an ebook to it to kind of help deliver the context a little less conceptually and just a little more direct. And we even created some routines that are very easy and basic to follow that are available in that ebook. If you've already purchased the product, you already have access to this. But then we also added a group workout session and an extra hour of content. We added an hour-long fitness seminar that he did for my team at our gym. And there's a lot of question and answer in that. And it's just going to help you kind of get a better picture of what we are doing with this efficient strength workout that we've been doing. And again, this workout only takes 15 minutes a week. If you're doing it twice, it takes 30. But still, what strength and conditioning program designed for people that don't have to be on steroids and don't want to get injured, don't want to have a second job by having to work out all the time? What else is there out there that even compares to this course? To me, there really isn't anything, especially designed specifically for jiu-jitsu athletes. And so if that is interesting to you, be sure to go to simplifyingjiujitsu.com/15. That is simplifyingjiujitsu.com/15 and check this course out. I promise you, you won't be disappointed. And we are going to keep updating it and keep making this course even better. And also, some people have asked, could we get access to the Steve bundle if we purchased this course? And I decided to just leave that access to the Steve bundle, which is all of the courses that my dad has done with our Simplifying Jiu-Jitsu page, and all those courses, and they're half off with the purchase of Efficient Strength for BJJ in 15 minutes. And so that's all I have for you. Let's go ahead and get back into the episode. And so for you, with all these different conversations you've gotten to have with all kinds of different high-level people, is there anybody who sticks out as having more of an influence or an effect on your game in jiu-jitsu?
From the people I've spoken to, there are many moments, I would say, on the podcast where someone put an idea forth that really changed the way that I think. It's not really jujitsu specific, but Christian Graugart from BJJ Globetrotters was on our podcast quite a while ago. The way that he talked about creativity and trying to give back to the community and the people around you really kind of changed the philosophy of everything that I do, especially on the podcast. We also had some great chats with John Thomas, where we kind of jousted back and forth talking about, okay, when are like concepts and principles good and when are they not good? And his answers kind of tempered my thinking. I used to be much more of the mind that, all concepts all the time, all mental models, nothing else. But John did bring up some good examples. Like, look, sometimes you just need to roll up your sleeves and do the freaking arm bar, right? Sometimes you just need to get time in on the mat. And it is possible, if you tend to be a more analytical person, to overthink things and basically paralyze yourself just because you're so focused on thinking about the concepts and how all of these things work that you're not actually just getting the reps in. And you need a bit of both, right? So there have been a lot of situations. Again, we talked about Lovato. He also famously gave me shit on the podcast one time for referring to myself as a hobbyist. And he had some good points, which is, look, I mean, if you committed a significant portion of your life to jiu-jitsu and you're getting life-changing value out of it and you're giving back to the community, can you really call yourself a hobbyist? Is that a fair label? And I'm thinking, look, if this guy's going to tell me I'm not a hobbyist, I'm definitely not going to argue with him, right? So that one of the coolest things about doing a show like that, as I'm sure you have also found, is you get exposed to all of these different takes and different ideas. And every once in a while, in your quest to bring information to the public, someone drops something on you that really changes the way you think as well. And that, to me, has been the main takeaway and the big benefit I've gotten out of doing the podcast for as long as I have.
Man, that is huge. And this is kind of just how I wanted to segue the main kind of idea that I wanted to talk to you about. And that is when it comes to, a lot of times I've gotten to experience being on mental models before. And, you really do a good job of having a topic and having an idea that is going to be discussed, but kind of the way that you can dig deeper, using questions to just dig deeper and get more information. To me, it was like nothing I've ever experienced. And I've always enjoyed mental models. And so I had assumed that it would be like that. But I just kind of wanted to start with more of a broad question and then kind of dig deeper on this skill set that you seem to have. And that is, what are some things that you notice people lack in the jiu-jitsu community when it comes to whether just asking questions or just being curious in jiu-jitsu in general?
Good question. I mean, I would say in terms of curiosity, most people who are knee deep in jiu-jitsu, they're curious, right? There's always something new to learn. I don't know many people who have reached a point in their jiu-jitsu community where they just kind of stop being curious. If that happens, that's usually a symptom of a broader problem like burnout, right? Or lost motivation. And so the problem there is usually not curiosity. The problem is this person is just done. They don't want to do it anymore. I would say that the thing that I try to do from our show is I try to, number one, like you said, I always want to have a clear topic. Most people, when they do a podcast or any sort of media like this, they're thinking from the perspective of themselves or maybe the perspective of the guest. But you always have to bear in mind that when you do a show, you're doing it for a third party that's not there, right? You're doing it for the listener, ultimately. And that listener is not you. They're going to have a very different demographic, right? I mean, look, I've been training for 15 years. I know that most of my listeners have probably been training for a lot less than that. And so I have to be very mindful of the things that I say, because if I just go too deep into the reads and I don't explain something, I'm going to lose 70% of the listeners right off of the bat. The good news is, though, I'm a total idiot. So that makes it really, really easy to talk like a total idiot, right? The benefit I find actually to being a hobbyist is it's a lot easier to be curious because I'm not so deep in the reads that I have knowledge I can take for granted. If you are someone who trains and lives the jiu-jitsu life full time and you watch every single comp and you watch every single instructional, it's easy to get afflicted by that curse of knowledge where you know so much that you can't put yourself in the perspective of a new person anymore. And so I always try to do that. I try to think, look, okay, if I were someone tuning into this podcast, I didn't know what BJJ Mental Models was. I didn't know who the guest was. What would I get out of this conversation? And how can I, as the host, make sure that, first of all, this thing is structured. So it's not just some rambling talk about like what this guy ate for breakfast, but rather we actually have a lesson that we're trying to put together. And how can I make sure this is a lesson that this person is really especially qualified to discuss? And then also, how can I ask progressively more challenging questions so that we start off basic, but by the end of it, there's still some value for the brown and the black belts, right? So I always try to escalate in that manner. Start simple, start with the assumption of no base knowledge, that this is the first time the audience has ever met this person, the first time they've ever thought about this concept, and then we dig in a lot deeper over time as we go. The other thing I do is I try very hard to avoid visual descriptions. It's not easy in audio to teach a visual technique, right? I mean, if I want to sit down here and explain to you how to do an arm bar, we're going to lose almost everybody. But what we can do is we can talk about the philosophy of an arm bar, the strategy of an arm bar, how maybe some tricks you can deploy to make your arm bar a bit sneakier, right? Strategy, tactics, philosophy, those communicate very well through audio. And so I try to lean on that. When it gets to the point of, okay, someone doesn't know how to actually do the technique, where do I put my left hand? That is a very difficult thing to do through audio. So I try to avoid those topics if I can.
I think something you do well is you make sure to, saying things like you're a hobbyist, saying things like you're dumb. You try to not come off arrogant. But for me, I've dealt with you enough. I know you're a very intelligent person. And so it can't just be that you're dumb and that's, or you are ignorant to these ideas and that's why you can dig deeper. It seems to me like there is a level of not being married to ideas to allow yourself to dig deeper. So, and you can disagree with that if you think that is wrong, but if that is the case, do you have any thoughts on how somebody can, because in jiu-jitsu nowadays, especially, you can't get on YouTube without seeing some absolute, something that says, no, this is the only way to train. This is the only way to think. This is the only way to do, to do jiu-jitsu, or this is the only way to do an armbar. Do you have any thoughts on kind of preventing that in somebody's own jiu-jitsu journey, as it seems like you have been able to do?
Yeah, I actually have a lot of thoughts on that. This is one of the ways that an instructor can really screw up their students by accident, which is by speaking with more certainty than they intended. Or maybe they don't speak with more certainty, but it's interpreted that way. I mean, I can give you examples, right? For a long time, I struggled with getting my guard passed. And it took me a while to realize that it was because at some point in time, an instructor had told me, never turn away from the person, always face them, never ever turn away. It's instant death. Don't do it. And so that part of my brain just closed off, that I should never turn away. The problem is you can't always prevent that, right? If you are 75% of the way through getting through your opponent doing a leg drag pass on you, by definition, you've turned away, right? Whether you want to or not. So now you've got two choices. Choice number one is try to force a move that isn't going to work, like trying to regard. Very, very hard to do a traditional regard if someone is leg dragging you. Or number two, embrace the possibility that there's a whole world of other techniques like turtling away, right? So I completely neglected that part of my game for a long time because I had been told at some point, don't ever do this, full stop. And I think instructors can very easily, just in their desire to just get the message out there, they can sometimes come across as being more absolute than maybe they intended. And I think students also have the tendency to interpret things as absolutes when it wasn't intended to be done that way. So, I remember there were cases in the past where an instructor told me, if you're on bottom side control, get an underhook. And so for a long time, every time I was on bottom side control, the only thing I would try to do is get an underhook. And 80% of the time, it just wouldn't work. And I thought I was doing it wrong. And it wasn't until I got way more experience that I realized, okay, what my instructor meant to say was, in this particular situation where the person is at this, their body is this high up on you, then you can go for the underhook. It was not a blanket statement that, whenever you're in bottom side control, go for the underhook. There's context, right? And I think that instructors would be very well suited to remind their students about that, because it's so easy for people to think that there's always a right answer. If you know the right technique, you can always get out. That's just not the case. Context matters so much in jiu-jitsu. And I think we always need to remember that there are no absolutes, right? Everything is relative. Even very common sense advice that sounds like it should always be true, there's going to be some exception. I mean, as an example, in the early days of the podcast, you will hear me talk extensively about the importance of taking the inside channel, right? Going for underhooks, going for the inside position, getting between their legs. And I would tell people, this is what you always want to do. And then I started seeing people like Lachlan and Margot Ciccarelli go around the outside. Now, that's not really a strategy that works great for me specifically because of my body type. But I'm not going to tell Lachlan and Margot that they can't do this, right? They found a way to make the outside attack work. So that was an example of where I was proven wrong, right? I thought something was an absolute, and it turns out it's not, right? It's just one option out of many. So again, it's like you said, just nuanced thinking, right? Just not thinking in absolutes and understanding there's always an exception to the rule. Sometimes there's more exceptions than there are actual rules. And that's one of the fun things about jiu-jitsu is it's just so chaotic, right? So many things can happen. You never really know what's going to happen next.
So kind of that being said, what is, when we're looking at concepts, when we're looking at mental models, for you personally, what are the ones that you're trying to apply? What are the ones that you're trying to, or how do you decide on, hey, this big idea is something that I want to pursue and that I want to try to figure out?
Usually I'm looking for patterns. And that doesn't always mean it's something that I experience myself. The benefit to doing the podcast is I can put my experience in front of other coaches and they can share their experience. And now I've got more data points, right? If someone else can confirm what I'm saying, then I know it's not just me. But what I often look for these days is things that are generally going to hold true no matter what I'm doing. So an example I've given on the show many times, I used to struggle a lot with guard passing. I couldn't do it. I would always get tangled up in people's sleeves and, I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, locked in their guard, and no technique that I could try to do. Like I'd be sitting in that person's guard thinking, okay, Steve, let's do a knee cut pass. Remember, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the knee cut pass. Never worked, right? It would never work because as soon as I do step 1, my opponent's already adjusted and now the other steps don't make sense anymore. And at some point I started just thinking, okay, what if I throw all of that away? And I don't try to do a technique, but instead I just try to keep a few goalposts in my mind at all times. Like one is, don't let them get controlling grips on me. Whenever someone is able to secure a grip on me, deal with that first before I do anything else. Little things like that made a massive difference. And what I found was if I focused on these things, it was easier for me to execute because I had less stuff going on in my head while I was rolling. But also, the funny thing is the techniques that I wanted to do actually became easier because the situations to create them just happened more organically if I was just thinking more simply. So that to me is what I look for. I look for things that generally hold true in multiple situations. Like a good example, talking about Preet and Chris Payne's is deny access to your armpit space, right? Don't let them get your underhooks. That is such an important idea in so many situations in jiu-jitsu, whether you are standing up or whether you are on bottom side control, or even if you are passing their guard, usually you don't want to let them get access to that space. So, I mean, in jiu-jitsu, people will sometimes call that the elbow-knee connection, or they will tell you to stay coiled, right? That's a perfect example. I mean, if you give me a white belt, I'm probably not going to try to teach them complex techniques out of the gate until they understand those basic ideas, like don't let them get into your elbow-knee space. If you can prevent people from doing that, you can make them way more effective out of the gate without having to overwhelm them with technical details and minutia.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And on that same note, though, I've talked to Chris about this, about the times that you do let people in your armpit space, because, just in that idea of this 99% of the time, this is what you should be doing. But as he explains it, when Conor McGregor puts his arms behind his back when fighting Floyd Mayweather, obviously you should have your hands up. You should be protecting your chin. But when you become great at striking, when you can open up your chin to hopefully open up some other space. It's the same kind of with the elbow knee space. So that does, to me, make just completely perfect sense in that. Maybe kind of a step back on this. When you are for your podcast, when you are preparing your questions for a guest, how does that kind of look? Is this something that you have this list of questions that you're gonna ask, or is it something that as you don't understand, you say, hey, I want to dig deeper into this?
So the way that I structure an interview is almost the same as the way I structure a role or going to a class, honestly. I come in with some broad goals about what I want to do, but I try not to be too specific. I try not to orchestrate the whole thing and script it, right? First of all, because if I script an interview, everyone's going to know it's scripted, right? Scripted interviews just hit different. They don't feel natural and organic. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like if you listen to an audiobook, that's scripted, still awesome, right? Nothing wrong with it. But a podcast allows you to convey knowledge in a way that is organic and natural. And for a lot of people, especially people like myself, we find it easier to learn that way. So it's really important to me to keep things organic and natural. It's much like how, if you're doing public speaking, the advice that you'll often be given is don't try to recite every word from memory because something's going to go wrong, right? And you're going to forget something, and then you're going to just completely derail. But also things can happen, right? If there's a Q&A period, you can't always script that. You don't know what's going to happen. So normally when you're preparing for a speech, people will tell you to know your big talking points, kind of have an idea of what you want to say, but reserve the right to be flexible in your approach. And that's basically what I try to do on the podcast. When someone's coming on, the first thing I do is I ask kind of 3 questions to myself when I want to do an episode. I ask, okay, what's a topic that I can do that would be really helpful to people? Number 2, has that topic been done to death already? Because I don't want to, have the same conversation that's been had 30 times elsewhere. That's always a trick with a lot of guests that do a lot of media, right? I mean, I don't want to have someone on to talk about something that I know my listeners may have already heard them have the same conversation 12 times somewhere else. But then the third thing is I want to know, okay, who's the guest that can be uniquely qualified to have this discussion with me? Someone who's passionate about it, who knows about it better than anyone else, who can communicate the ideas well. And so I'd say that's a big difference between what I do versus what a lot of other people do, which is I often don't plan an episode with a guest in mind. I have a topic in mind, and then based on that, I poll my community to try to figure out who would be the best guest. So when you came on our show, for instance, you came on because I had Taylor Biaggi on, and she had talked specifically about designated winner, which is a fascinating concept. I've never heard anyone else vocalize that. And I asked her to tell me, where did that come from? And she told me, and I thought, well, now I got to have this guy on, right? I mean, so that to me is I guess one thing that's different is I lead with a goal in mind. I do the same thing when I train, right? When I go into class, I have a broad goal for what I want to do. I try not to get too specific about it because you can never control what's really going to happen in a role, right? But I might just have something very basic in mind. Like today, I want to work on untethered guard retention. So maybe I want to be playing butterfly guard. I want to be playing shin on shin or instep guard or whatever you call it. And so my goal is to try to move into that position when the opportunity presents itself. And when I get there, my goal is to not hesitate. I just want to go boom, right to a sweep. That's kind of all I go into class thinking about. And then afterwards I reflect. And if I did well, that's awesome. If something didn't work as expected, I change it for next time. And I do the same thing when structuring a podcast interview, right? I come in with this very broad goal. And then from there, I reserve the right to change it on the fly because sometimes people just say or do very interesting things. And I always want to reserve the right to stop, pivot, and adapt if they touch on something that I think is really worth covering.
So when you are, and I just kind of want to dig just a little deeper on this, and then I have a few more random finishing questions to ask you more about I think my curiosity. When you are deciding to pivot, is there anything, and this doesn't have to be on a podcast. This can just be a general conversation where you are just trying to gain a deeper understanding. But is there something that you're looking for, something conceptual even, that you are trying to see that your guest is giving you, that makes you go, oh, wow, we should dig deeper on that?
Yeah. So this has gotten more complicated as time goes on, just because we've got a pretty big back catalog of episodes and content now. But every time I identify a new quote unquote mental model, right? Basically a new pattern that I think, oh shit, that's going to be interesting, I want to write that down. Usually I'll write it down. I'll put a blog post together about it. I'll put it on our online database and I'll put it in the show notes. And I always try to keep those ideas in mind, because if I'm right in my assessment that these are actually recurring patterns, they're going to come up again, right? I mean, if I have a conversation with Chris Paynes about the elbow-knee connection, and then you come on the podcast 2 weeks later and you mention something similar, I'm going to try to tie it back to what I already talked about. I want to demonstrate to the listener that there's a pattern here, right? This is not something that just you are saying, but we can present 5 other people who have reached the same conclusion through different ways. And then I will try to, if possible, without being too pedantic about it, I will try to send them to the website or send them to a relevant podcast episode where we talked about that. So I always try to look for the spider webs that connect everything together. To the best extent possible, I do want every episode we do to be like a standalone capsule lesson that people can unpack and get something out of. But I also want to, if we've identified a valuable pattern, I want to take a second to put a pin in that so the listener knows that this is something that merits further study from them, right? And usually the way that I figure that out is if it's come up multiple times in conversation with a lot of guests that I respect, probably it deserves to have an article in our database and maybe some content that we make about it specifically.
Man, that's a really great answer to that. Would you say that that's kind of how would you say your mind kind of works in pattern? Do you feel like naturally you are good at that, or that this is just a skill that you've developed over time?
It's hard to say, honestly. I think probably more realistically, it's the only way I can work around the limitations of my dog shit memory. I just forget things left and right. And you, I'm sure, have encountered this. My memory got 10 times worse the instant I became a father, because now you've got this constant like child that is just requires your attention at all points in time. And it's very hard to focus. And I found my attention just got even more fragmented than it already was. The big challenge I have these days is I'm like the guy from Memento, right? I'm just constantly forgetting things. I got to write it all down. So for me, that approach of organizing my thoughts conceptually has always helped me not just retain information, but better understand what I've actually learned, right? If I can plot something down, if I can sit down and think, man, when Josh was talking about designated winner, that actually sounds like this psych paper that someone else cited on our podcast. Maybe there's a commonality between, like, that kind of information to me is very helpful. And interestingly, speaking of psych papers, I mean, from a human psychology standpoint, if you take the time to do that and actually map out your thoughts, it improves your understanding and your ability to retain and retrieve that information later, right? We call that effortful retrieval. The idea being that, what part of the reason you would do things like take notes, it's actually not because you're ever going to consult those notes. If you're like most people, when you take notes, you'll probably never look at them again, but that's okay. The practice of actually taking notes forces you to spend a moment deliberately thinking and retrieving that information from your brain and strengthening the pathways, right? So next time you got to think about that, it becomes even easier. That's a great trick actually for instructors, right? You don't want to make things too easy for your students, because if you just spoon feed them answers and they don't have to work for them, they simply won't remember that info or be able to apply it. So you always want to make sure that you're kind of pushing them so that they have to work to remember things, work to recall things. And that's why so many modern coaching techniques involve making things a bit mentally uncomfortable for the student, because you need their brain to be engaged. That's part of the reason why the classical dead drilling approach is so frowned upon these days, is because, look, if I tell you to bang out 100 arm bars on an unresisting opponent, you can turn your brain off to do that, right? I mean, it might be tricky the first 10 reps if you've never done it before, but at some point you're not going to even be thinking about what you're doing anymore. Your body's going to be doing the arm bars and your mind's going to be thinking about the groceries you have to buy after class, right? That's not good for your skill retention. So as a coach, we want to structure things so that people do have to think hard about what they're learning, and that actually helps them retain that info.
Kind of just a little transition here, but you maybe even touched on it with, dog and deadpan drilling a little bit. I just kind of wanted to get some of your current thoughts. I know you have, on your podcast, kind of done a deep dive on the ecological approach in jiu-jitsu and constraint-based training. And I just kind of was curious as to what your current thought of the ecological approach is, its uses. Is it something that, you think that we should drop everything and just all go ecological? And just your opinion on that.
How much hate mail do you want to get here? Because I can.
Oh man,
I can
only get
hate mail for you here. Okay. Okay. So I guess before we dig into that, do we need to explain what we mean by the ecological approach?
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. I will give my very brief layman's explanation of what this is, because most people who engage on Reddit or follow prominent people, they will have probably heard something about the ecological approach, and it can be very hard to wrap your head around what this means. I will attempt here to explain it simply. I am not a scientist. I am not super well versed on this. I reserve the right to be wrong, but this is my working understanding. The way that I like to think of this, right? I'm going to assume that everyone here has seen The Matrix. You know that scene where Neo is learning kung fu, and they basically just like plug a thing into the back of his head and they press a few buttons and suddenly he learns kung fu. It's just like uploaded into his brain. All that the ecological approach really says is human beings can't learn that way, right? It doesn't work, right? I can't just download the info out of my brain and put it into yours. We won't learn that way. At least we won't learn movement that way, right? Maybe if we're talking about things to memorize is a bit different, but if we're talking about how to perform something that your body has to do, it's not going to work. And there's a bunch of reasons why, right? One reason is we're different people, right? If your arms are longer than mine, if you have a different athletic body composition than me, we might have different ways of doing that move. But the other thing that many instructors often fail to take into account in their teaching is, look, techniques only work if you can do them against a resisting opponent. I mean, yeah, I can sit there and do 10 dead reps of an armbar against you, but as soon as you start trying to defend, things get so variable that there's really no way that you as the coach can give me all of the instructions I need. You cannot just download all of that into my mind like Neo in The Matrix. I have to practice myself. I have to feel it myself. I have to get experience getting different looks and different feels, right? Like what happens if you figure four your arms to block it? What happens if you try to hitchhike? What happens if you bridge and stack me? What happens if you're a giant? What happens if you're small? All of these things I cannot learn from someone telling me. I have to learn by doing it myself. That's all really the ecological approach says, is that human beings, when we learn, it's not just about what we quote unquote know in our brains. It's about how we work with the environment. The environmental context changes everything, which is why dead drilling is generally a problem, right? If your opponent is just resisting, you're basically doing like you're basically doing CrossFit at that point, right? You're burning some calories doing that armbar rep, but it is completely divorced from how a real armbar would look. So ecological coaches will structure their classes so that they're less reliant on, I tell you the 10 steps to do the perfect armbar, but rather I put in some constraints and some guardrails so that you're probably going to figure out the right way to do it yourself. Now, where this gets confusing is some coaches will make it sound like their students are all just spontaneously inventing techniques on their own, right? So like, no, learning eco doesn't mean that your students are all going to like invent the go-go plata independently on their own. But it just means that as a coach, you try to put them in positions and you give them guidance where like an arm bar is the likely thing that's going to happen here, right? Or you give them some high level guidance, like your job is to separate this person's arm from their body to pull it free. The other person's job is to keep it there, and you just practice and play. And the coach's job is to enforce those constraints. So whenever someone is kind of deviating from what you want them to learn, you kind of manipulate the constraints to push them back towards it, right? So the best example I can give here, other than the Neo thing, is it's a lot like Socratic learning, where rather than me giving you the answer, I kind of ask the questions that guide you to the answer on your own. That's basically what eco is. There's a whole bunch of debate in the or in the jiu-jitsu community right now about eco. I honestly think people are debating the wrong thing here. I mean, they're really, if people want to argue that eco doesn't work or isn't valid science, that's not an argument that jiu-jitsu people are going to be able to win, right? I mean, there is enough actual real science, like not jiu-jitsu bro science, but enough actual real science out there to give us an adequate reason to believe that eco is how human beings learn to move. It's at least one of the best explanations we have now. So the question of whether eco works or not is not really true, right? Like eco is just a scientific way to explain how human beings learn movement. It's not a method, right? It's not like the Atkins diet, where if you follow this particular diet, you're going to get jacked. It's just an explanation. It's a framework for how we think human beings learn. And then you build your own framework on top of that, right? Greg Souders is probably a good example of someone who's built his own framework on top of that. That is my understanding of it. I think that it is really important that everyone in the jiu-jitsu community, I mean, if you're not going to take the time to learn eco, you should at least take the time to understand that dead drilling is not a good way to learn, right? Live resistance is always going to be better. I don't think you need to be an eco enthusiast to understand that. I mean, people like Ryan Hall, Rob Bernacki, Matt Thornton have been talking about this for decades at this point. It's just that now we're mapping that to a particular scientific framework. But this is not new, right? A lot of other coaches are already doing this to some extent. Basically, you want to give people the ability to play, to figure things out themselves, and you don't want to have too many dead reps, right? That's ultimately what eco is. However you do it, I think that aspect of live training, yeah, it's important. If you're going to a gym and everything is just dead reps of techniques over and over again, and if you're having a problem where you can't remember anything, or you can't actually use the stuff you're practicing in a live role, that's probably an indication that your gym isn't using that ecological approach enough.
So let's say, hypothetically speaking, you had your own jiu-jitsu school. Would it be an ecological approach jiu-jitsu school, or what would you say it would look like, when it came to the training method used?
I mean, I would not call it an ecological gym for a variety of reasons. One being, look, I am not a scientist. I think it's kind of disrespectful to paint myself in the clothing of a scientist and act like I am, right? At the end of the day, I can use the lessons from there, but I don't want people to, like, I'm not going to cosplay as a scientist, right? But the other thing too is I think there is a lot more to being a good coach than just eco. I mean, eco is an important part of it because that dictates how our bodies learn movement. At least that's how we think it does. But look, there is a lot more to being a good coach than just learning how to do moves well, right? I mean, my brother and I were talking about this on BJJ Mental Models, right? Look, if your gym is miserable, if your people don't want to train there, it doesn't matter how good your training practices are, right? If people are quitting, you could be on paper the best coach in the world, but if you can't get people in the door and retain them, it doesn't matter, right? And look, we've seen this, right? A lot of examples of very prominent coaches who have had mass departures because people just didn't want to train with them. There's a lot of things about psychology, motivation, the way that you communicate, the way that you persuade people, the way that you get people on board with your ideas, the way that you run a team. A lot of that stuff, in my mind, is just as, if not more important than the eco piece. I mean, look, at the end of the day, if a superstar athlete walks into your gym and they're totally dedicated to being the best in the world at jiu-jitsu and they're willing to put in the work and they've got the genetics and the athletic propensity, like, they're probably going to be pretty good whether you do eco or not, honestly, right? Just due to the time spent, they're good. Yeah, I mean, look, if someone is actually doing live training, they're going to get ecological benefit on their own from the fact that they are. So I think that although it's important, I would not say it's the most important part of coaching. I think that a lot of the people who talk about eco, they they act like it is the single one most important thing. I don't think it is. I think it is one of many important variables that a coach must maintain. So if I were running a gym, I would not advertise it as an eco gym for the same reason I would not advertise it as a fun gym, right? Like, yeah, I believe jiu-jitsu should be fun. I think it's the most important thing, but there's more to being a good coach than just fun, right? So for me, it's like, it's part of an equation. It's part of a formula, but it's not the whole formula by itself.
That was such a good answer. I was trying to stump you on that. That was a great answer to
someone fact check me. Like I said, I just want to, put the blanket out there. I mean, obviously I've spoken to a lot of people about eco who know it a lot more than me. And I've kind of had a ton of discussions about it. But at the end of the day, I am not a behavioral psychologist, right? So I do reserve the right to be wrong on this. Please direct all of your hate mail and corrections to Josh McKinney.
That's that is a perfect, I thought that was a perfect answer for that. I wanted to kind of bait you on the eco question a little bit. And I really think that even for me, that gives me so much more perspective on it. Really looking at the other parts of being a good coach. But we're getting kind of to the end, and I always like to kind of finish with a specific question. And so for you've gotten to talk to so many high-level guys. I'm sure you've gotten so much great advice. So I'm sure that this answer will be hard for you. But if I just ask you, what is the best, or at least some of the best jiu-jitsu advice that you have ever received, what would that be?
Oh boy. To identify one particular thing is kind of hard. I will say, like I mentioned earlier, I think the most impactful conversation I had personally on the podcast was with Christian Graugart. We're just kind of talking about his framework for creating. As someone who does a lot of podcasting and a lot of writing and content creation, it very much struck home with me, even though it wasn't specifically about jiu-jitsu. I would say, though, that in terms of conversations that really moved the needle for me personally, like I said, we've had some great conversations with Lovato. A conversation I always recommend people listen to is episode 50 with Rob Bernacki, where we talk about his alignment framework. For those who don't know, Rob's got this framework that I won't go into the full details, but basically, if you're struggling to remember how the hell jiu-jitsu works, his framework is probably the simplest thing that you can learn in 10 minutes to make sense of this crazy sport, right? It makes you understand that this actually isn't as complicated as a lot of people make it out to be. I've had some amazing conversations with Emily Kwok about peak performance. In addition to being a multi-time world champion, she's also a peak performance coach. I mean, of course, she works closely with some of the absolute best in the world. I know she's worked with Josh Waitskin and, of course, Marcelo and a bunch of others. And in addition to being an ace competitor and a teacher now, she's also a peak performance consultant. So I loved those conversations with her, so much so that I actually switched lineage. I'm technically under Emily at the moment. That's how impactful that was to me. So there's just been a bunch of great conversations. I also tend to like the conversations that are more cultural. When we get a chance to do something that I think might actually help the community. Like we've had some really raw episodes, honestly, about depression and misconduct and just other really heavy subjects. Not necessarily fun listening, but I've had people just really kind of open up and share their story on the podcast in a way that really meant a lot to me personally. If we can put out anything that's going to improve the jiu-jitsu world out there and make people's lives better, that to me is always that is the best thing that I could possibly do. And if I've ever done that, then I'm just absolutely thrilled about it. And I would say some of the conversations we've had, I mean, about things like sexual abuse and just cultish behavior in gyms. Some of the conversations we've had about depression, right? During the pandemic, we had Dr. David Lay, black belt out of I believe Albuquerque, New Mexico, and also a really well-known clinical psychologist. He came on and just had an amazing talk with us about depression in jiu-jitsu and how to break out of depressive cycles. And that kind of stuff ultimately really stuck with me. That's the kind of stuff that I quote at family dinners, right? So to me, I'd say those are the kinds of conversations I've had that were the most meaningful to me.
Man, another great answer. Is there anything you want to say to finish?
I mean, I just want to thank you so much for everything you do. I want to thank you for having me on here. I mean, finally, I Suck at Jiu-Jitsu. That's a podcast I am qualified to be on, so I greatly appreciate it. I want to thank you for being such a great rep to the community, for pioneering really cool collaborative ideas like Designated Winner, for hanging out with my brother, and you're basically a friend of the family at this point, for helping my customers as well, right? I mean, you do rolling reviews for our premium guys and girls, and I really appreciate that too. So just want to throw it back at you. Thanks for everything you do, Josh.
Man, thank you so much for being on the show. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too, man. Anytime.
And that is the episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This was a really fun one for me to do. Like I said, I've been planning on doing this one for quite a while, and I'm just so happy that we were able to get it done, get it together, and get this interview out. I think that a lot of people will kind of enjoy this. And then I also know that there are quite a few people who their two favorite podcasts are BJJ Mental Models and the I Suck at Jiu-Jitsu show, because we both do take a pretty conceptual approach to jiu-jitsu, or maybe you just absolutely love half Asian people. And Steve and I, we both fall in that category. And so, just doing that, though, doing this episode, I think is kind of a fun crossover for a lot of people. And, we are going to continue to work together. As Steve even told you guys on the podcast, if you are subscribed to BJJ Mental Models Premium, you can get me to review your match footage. And that's something I've really been enjoying doing. And honestly, it has been it's kind of been a blast for me. I never really have done that before, reviewed match footage online. I've reviewed footage for my students before, but I've never gotten to do it in that capacity. And so getting to do this a couple times a week, and even having people that have requested me again, and getting to see the updates in their game and the growth in their game from some of the tips and concepts that I highlight and try to help them with has been a blast. And so just shout out to BJJ Mental Models Premium. If you guys are interested, it's definitely worth it. And then if you don't want me reviewing your match footage, you want somebody more relevant than me, there are a lot of people more relevant than me that review match footage for BJJ Mental Models. And so be sure to check that out. Also, like I told you guys, this Thursday, we will be coming out with just an episode on gaining more understanding, on asking better questions, because I think, like I said, that this is a hole in the jiu-jitsu space, and I think it could really be helpful for a lot of people if we try to fill that hole. And so if you enjoyed this episode, I am sure you're going to enjoy the one on Thursday. If you are like, well, how will I know that the one on Thursday came out? Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel or to wherever you're getting your podcast from. Just make sure to subscribe so you are getting updated every time we are putting out more content. And lastly, make sure, if you are not subscribed to the YouTube channel, if you like learning jiu-jitsu more efficiently and effectively, and just like how we do on the I Suck at Jiu-Jitsu show, you like it tied into people having fun doing jiu-jitsu and some good humor with your jiu-jitsu learning, just to keep you entertained and to keep you engaged. That's really what we've been focusing on the YouTube channel. Producer Bryce Allen has just been killing it lately on the YouTube channel, putting out so much content. If you include the podcast, we are putting out content almost every day of the week at this point. And of course, it's on YouTube, so it's completely free. And so you guys should check that out. But that is all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope that you guys sign up for all of the different things that I have shouted out on this episode. And most importantly, I hope today's episode helps you guys suck just a little bit less at jiu-jitsu. Have a great day, guys.